The air was unusually still that evening, as though the gods themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere beyond the jagged hills and trembling olive trees, the last amber light of the sun bled across the sky like a wounded beast, casting long shadows across the camp. The Thermopylae Pass, narrow and unyielding, stood like a silent gate to fate, its cliffs steep and its waters below whispering ancient secrets with every wave that kissed the stones. The scent of pine resin and sweat lingered in the air, and the distant clang of a hammer against bronze echoed faintly, fading into the rhythm of a world settling in for the night. Yet, for the warriors who had chosen to stand against the tide, they could not truly stem. This was no ordinary night. It was the eve of legend. Doro sat on a flat stone near the edge of the encampment, wrapping a strip of cloth around the hilt of his sword. His fingers moved slowly with purpose, though he barely noticed the task at hand. The act was more ritual now than preparation. The blade was already sharp. He had honed it just after the evening meal, each stroke across the whetstone an echo of his breath, calm and deliberate. The cloth, stained from past battles, smelled faintly of oil and iron. He tied it tightly, then pulled on it once, not to test its strength, but to ground himself in something physical, something tangible. Because in the quiet folds of his mind, a storm was beginning to rise. He had faced death before. All Spartans had. It was not the fear of pain or the unknown that made this night heavy. It was the clarity of its certainty. Thermopylae was no ambush, no calculated strike under the veil of darkness. It was a message carved into stone with blood. Stand or fall. No retreat, no surrender. It was the kind of stand where a warrior's name either vanished into silence or lived on through centuries of whispered awe. Doros knew this. He knew, as every man in the phalanx knew, that they were not expected to return, and that knowledge sat within him like an ember, glowing hot but quiet, an ache of knowing too much and too clearly. Behind him, the camp murmured with low voices, men sharing tales, adjusting armor, laughing more loudly than they normally would, the kind of laughter that cracks against the silence not from joy, but from defiance. Leonidas walked between the fires, not as a king this night, but as one of them. His steps were slow, deliberate, the weight of history already pressing onto his shoulders. When he met Doros's eyes, there was no speech, no counsel, just a nod, a quiet, wordless communion between men who did not need to ask what the other felt. Because they both knew. All of them knew. Doros leaned back, letting his shoulders touch the bark of an old tree behind him. Its branches stretched toward the darkening sky, gnarled and ancient, like fingers trying to hold back the night. He listened. The wind moved like a ghost through the leaves, soft and uncertain, as though even nature questioned what was coming. Somewhere to his right, a soldier hummed a lullaby, something from his childhood, a fragment of melody passed down from mother to son, now offered up to the stars in fragile defiance. Others sharpened spears. Some stared into the fire, and a few had closed their eyes, as if to steal a moment of peace before dawn shattered everything. The stars above had begun to appear, faint at first, then boldly emerging from behind wisps of drifting cloud. Doros traced their patterns, not as a stargazer, but as a man searching for something eternal, something untouched by the blood and iron of the world below. The constellations had names: Orion, Andromeda, the Bear. But tonight they were simply sentinels, watching without judgment, unmoved by the fate of mortals. It comforted him oddly to know that they would remain after the battle was done, that the sky would remember what the earth would consume. A soft voice broke his trance. "Can't sleep?" It was Nicandros, his shield brother, the man who would fight beside him come morning. "No." Doros's voice was low, barely above the whispering wind. Nicandros sat beside him, resting his own shield against the tree trunk. "Me neither." He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, glancing toward the cliffs beyond. "Funny how the quiet is worse than the battle, isn't it?" Doros nodded. "Because the battle is simple. You move, you strike, you don't think. But here," he tapped his temple, "here's where the real war begins." Nicandros gave a dry chuckle, not out of humor, but understanding. "You ever think of home? Your wife?" "I think of her every time I close my eyes," Doros said. "But I don't dream of her now. Not tonight." "No?" "I dream of the boy I used to be," Doros said slowly. "The boy who thought war was glory, who imagined that dying in battle would be like the poet sang. Clean, noble. I wish I could talk to him. Tell him what it really means." "And what would you say?" "That it's not about glory. It's about standing for something even when you know you'll be swallowed whole by it." They sat in silence after that, letting the stillness wrap around them. The fire behind them crackled, sending faint sparks into the air that drifted like dying stars. Doros could hear the soft footsteps of another man nearby, pacing. Others had begun quiet prayers, some to Ares, others to Apollo or Hades, each man speaking not to avoid death, but to meet it with open eyes. In the corner of the camp, a young soldier knelt before his armor, brushing the dust from his greaves with shaking hands. He was barely more than a boy, his eyes wide not with fear, but something deeper, reverence maybe, or awe. Doros remembered that feeling, the first time he'd worn his father's helm, the weight of it pressing down like a crown. It was strange how the metal could feel heavier than any burden, yet you carried it like a second skin. The moon rose slowly, casting its pale light across the stones and shadows. Doros stood, stretching his limbs, his joints aching in that familiar, quiet way. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the pass, looking down at the narrow strip of land they would defend. It looked so small from up here, so fragile, and yet it would become a crucible, a place where legends would be burned into the bones of the earth. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night air, letting it fill his lungs like a prayer. Tomorrow they would stand shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, as they were trained, not because they believed they would win, but because they believed in each other. In the bond forged by years of toil and trial, in the unspoken promise that none would break the line. As Doros returned to his place by the tree, he felt something shift within him, not fear, not resolve, but something quieter, a kind of peace, the kind that comes only when you have already surrendered to fate and chosen to meet it head on. He sat again, his sword across his lap, and gazed up at the stars one last time before closing his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember, to hold in his heart the world as it was before the dawn took it away. The sky had deepened into a dome of velvet black, its surface freckled with stars, distant and indifferent. The wind had quieted as if it, too, understood the solemnity of the night. Campfires flickered low now, reduced to coals glowing like tired eyes. Only a few men still moved between the tents and trees, their armor catching the faint moonlight in soft flashes. Doros lay awake, staring at the inside of his helmet, which rested beside him like a silent companion. The ridge of it was still warm from the sun earlier that day. He reached out, fingers brushing the polished curve, and felt the cold bite of the bronze in contrast to the lingering heat of the earth. Sleep would not come, and he did not chase it. Sleep was a luxury for men with time, and time was no longer theirs. He propped himself up slowly, his joints creaking, not from age, but from training, from decades of drills, marches, combat, and carrying the armor that made a Spartan. His red cloak, thin and worn at the hem, slid across his back like a soft whisper. He picked up his shield next, a weight he knew better than he knew his own face. The asp is more than protection, more than bronze and wood. It was identity. A man without his shield was a disgrace to his kin, not just because it defended his life, but because it defended the man beside him. The shield was a symbol of the phalanx, of unity, of sacrifice. Doros looked at its surface, scarred and darkened from years of battle. There were gouges across its curve, some shallow, others deep, each one a moment where death had almost reached him and failed. He pressed his forehead gently against its surface, breathing slowly. It smelled of leather and sweat, of earth and rain, and something else, something ancient and sacred. The kind of scent that stayed with you long after the battle was over, like a ghost that clung to your soul. He whispered a prayer not to a god, but to the shield itself, a quiet plea between comrades. Hold with me, one more time. The first hints of morning were beginning to crawl across the horizon, not yet light, but the soft prelude of dawn. The sky was bruising with color, ink giving way to blood. Doros rose and stretched his limbs in silence. Around him, others stirred, not quickly, not in panic, but with the slow, practiced grace of men who had lived their lives for this moment. Nicandros was already awake, adjusting the strap on his cuirass. "No sleep again?" Doros asked, voice hoarse. Nicandros shrugged. "Didn't want to waste the last quiet hours of my life on dreams." Doros nodded. That sentiment settled in his bones. They broke there fast with strips of dried meat, hard bread, and cold olives. No one spoke much. What was there to say? No new strategies, no final plans. The line would hold until it broke, and when it broke, the Spartans would hold still. The Thespians would fight with them. So would the Thebans, though no one could guess what was truly in the Theban hearts. But in the center of that narrow pass, the Spartans would stand where the ground was hardest and the cost was highest. Doros moved through the rows of men like a ghost, nodding here, clasping a shoulder there. His touch was reassurance, but it was also farewell. He did not say goodbye. It was not their way. Instead, his presence spoke the words he didn't utter. "I see you. I trust you. I die with you." In the corner of the camp, Leonidas spoke with a small circle of elders. His voice was low, calm, the way a father might speak before sending his sons into the world. Not one of them looked shaken. They knew their role was not to survive, but to inspire, to embody an ideal so fully that it would outlive their bones and echo into centuries not yet imagined. The march to the pass began with the whisper of sandals on dirt, not the sound of a great army, but of men stepping into fate one heartbeat at a time. Shields slung over backs, spears held close, helmets tucked under arms. The path twisted gently through the foothills, trees on either side watching like sentinels. The morning birds called as if it were just another day, as if this day did not carry a weight that bent even the gods. The cliffs rose around them slowly, hemming them in. The sea to the east churned softly, waves frothing wide and restless. To the west, the mountains loomed like slumbering beasts, their peaks veiled in mist. The pass narrowed here, so narrow that even two wagons could not ride side by side. This was where they would make their stand. This was the gate. By the time they reached the chosen position, the sun was just cresting the hills, casting long golden rays across the field. The warmth kissed their skin, but no one basked in it. They formed the line in silence. Doros moved into place, his shield sliding seamlessly against the next. The familiar click as bronze kissed bronze. He could feel Nicandros at his left, another friend on his right. Together, they became something greater than men. They became the wall. Leonidas walked down the front, inspecting the formation with eyes that missed nothing. He did not shout. He didn't need to. When he reached Doros, he stopped for just a breath. Their eyes met, and again the nod, that quiet recognition of fate shared. As the hours passed, Doros let his mind drift, anchoring himself in memory. He remembered the agage, the brutal training of Spartan youth, the cold mornings, the endless drills, the pain and hunger, the fighting, the punishments. All of it carved into him like a statue from marble. And yet, even in that suffering, there had been pride. He had earned this place. He had been forged for this moment. He thought of his mother, stern, proud, a woman who had not wept when he was taken from her as a child, only said, "Return with your shield, or on it." That was the Spartan way, not cruel, just unflinching. The city did not raise boys, it forged warriors. He thought of his father, killed at Plataea, a spear through the throat. They said he didn't fall even as he bled, that he kept swinging until the light left his eyes. Doros had been 12 when the news came. He hadn't cried. Instead, he sharpened his training. He told himself, "I will be like him." And now he was. Around him the men were still, breath slow, eyes forward. They would not move until Leonidas commanded it. The cliffs towered, casting cool shadows across the ground. Birds circled above. Somewhere behind the hills, the dust of the Persian army was rising like smoke. They would come. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but they would come. Doros flexed his fingers against the spear. The wood felt solid, worn smooth where his grip had lived for years. He adjusted his footing slightly, distributing the weight evenly. The heat was building now, the sun higher, sweat beginning to trickle down his neck beneath the leather straps of his armor. And still they waited. In the silence, thoughts came unbidden. What would his wife do when the news reached her? Would she mourn? Or would she smile through the grief, proud that he had died a Spartan death? Would his name be remembered by his children? Would there even be stories passed down? Or would time slowly wash him away like a footprint on the shore? He tried not to care. He reminded himself that the act itself was the legacy, that even if his name was lost, his sacrifice would live in the marrow of Sparta, in the bones of future warriors who stood where he once stood. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the distant sound of marching. Not drums, not trumpets, just the steady thrum of thousands of feet against the earth, a tremor, not loud, but undeniable. Doros breathed in deeply, tasting the dust in the air. It was beginning. The others sensed it too, muscles tensed, Fingers tightened on spear shafts. Helmets were lifted and secured. The phalanx straightened, not from command, but from instinct. The line hardened, the wall rose, and Doros stood in its heart, silent and ready. The night air had grown colder. Leonidas adjusted his cloak gently, not out of discomfort, but to keep the soft rhythm of the world intact. Each motion was slow, deliberate, like turning the pages of a sacred text under moonlight. All around him, the shapes of his men rested in rows, curled under wool and fur, armor stacked like metallic shadows beside them. Their breathing was the heartbeat of the camp, soft and steady, woven into the darkness. The silence was not empty. It breathed with the lives of warriors, their memories, their prayers, their questions. He could almost hear the thoughts dancing above their heads. Thoughts of mothers waiting beyond the hills of Laconia, of sons who would carry their names, of lovers whose eyes would never grow old with them. The night before battle was always like this, bloated with meaning, heavy with presence. No one said much, but everything had already been spoken in the way they prepared, in the way they fought for their meals and polished their greaves. Leonidas let his eyes drift upward. The sky had begun to clear, and a cluster of stars shimmered with ancient indifference. Those same stars had seen Agamemnon rise, had watched Achilles fall, had traced the ships at Aulis like ghostly lanterns on the sea. Now they watched him, a single man with a crown of thorns shaped by duty, bearing the weight of both defiance and death. He didn't pray for survival. He prayed for clarity, for the strength to walk cleanly through the chaos without betraying the man he had become. A soft rustle near the edge of the encampment caught his ear, just a soldier shifting in sleep. Still, his senses had become alert, as if the very earth beneath him were preparing to move. He rose, slow as a shadow lengthening, and walked quietly across the firelit gloom. He did not need light to see. The rhythm of the camp lived in his body now, every footstep measured, every direction known. There, crouched near a small pile of olive pits and crumbling bread, was Demarian, one of the youngest. His back was turned, but the curve of his shoulders spoke of unrest. Leonidas approached without a word and settled beside him, lowering his body with the kind of grace only a man trained for decades could muster. Demarian startled, but did not speak. He looked out toward the narrowing cliffs, where Thermopylae's passage would funnel death like a blade's edge. The silence between them stretched long. "You cannot will the sun to rise slower," Leonidas said finally, voice a murmur. The young man, nodded. "I thought I was ready." "You are," the king answered gently. "But I feel as if I'm drifting," Demarian whispered, "as if the earth is shaking beneath me, and I'm not yet strong enough to stay upright." Leonidas looked at him. "The earth does not require you to stand tall tonight, only that you do not flee." There was a pause. Then more quietly, "And if I do?" "Then you are not a coward," he said simply. "You are simply a man, and tomorrow you may rise again to face what you ran from. But tonight you are here. That is enough." Demarian's eyes glistened with something close to shame. Leonidas reached out and gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Strength is not always the absence of fear. Often it is knowing your fear's name and walking with it anyway. They sat together like that, watching the stars, their breaths pooling in the chilled air. After a time, Demarian stood, bowed deeply, and returned to his bedroll with footsteps that carried just a little more weight. Leonidas remained. His own thoughts drifted back to Gorgo. He could see her in his mind's eye, standing at the gate of Sparta, chin lifted, eyes sharpened, not with tears, but with iron. Her strength was not born of softness, but of fire. When he had told her he must go, she had not asked why. She had simply said, "Then make your death worthy." The wind shifted. It carried the scent of distant pine, mixed faintly with ash and horses. He thought of his son. Still a boy, yet already showing signs of the man he might become. If Sparta survived this war, he would inherit a kingdom built from blood and bone, and if it did not, he would inherit legend. Leonidas stood once more and began to walk the camp's perimeter, not as a king, just as a man who could not sleep, who needed to feel the soil beneath his sandals. Each soldier he passed seemed carved from wax and breath. Caught in some halfway world between dream and duty, he recognized them all, not by name, always, but by their posture. The archer with a crooked shoulder, the hoplite who muttered in sleep, the scout who always slept with a hand on his dagger. They were not gods. They would bleed, and many would fall, but they had chosen this death, not for glory, not really, but for meaning. There is something sacred about a stand. When a man plants his feet, not because he believes he will survive, but because he believes that the ground behind him must not be taken. That is when a man becomes something else, not immortal, but unforgettable. Leonidas paused at the edge of the encampment, where the stone path gave way to darkness. Tomorrow, the enemy would come in waves. He imagined their eyes, Persians cloaked in silk, hardened by the lash and the scream of conquest. Xerxes would be watching far behind, surrounded by luxury and certainty. But certainty was not strength. Strength was silence and firelight. It was brothers breathing beside you. It was the taste of iron on your tongue and the knowledge that the line must hold, not for the world to see, but for the man beside you to believe. He turned, retracing his steps slowly, and the first hints of lavender painted the eastern sky. Dawn was coming, and with it everything. The hush of midnight had descended like a warm woolen cloak, and the darkness over Thermopylae was now absolute. Not even the moon dared to break the silence, as if the heavens themselves held their breath with the Spartans. Leon lay on the cool stone, his back pressed gently against the uneven ground, and listened to the sounds the earth offered him. Quiet footfalls from the patrol, the occasional metallic clink of a shifting spearhead, the wind rustling through the dry brush. There was a sacredness in this silence, not the silence of sleep or slumbering nature, but the silence of men suspended between life and legend. Time seemed to thin here, stretching into a heavy stillness where the future had not yet begun and the past refused to let go. The stars, brilliant and ancient, stared back down at him. He studied them, not with the eyes of a philosopher or stargazer, but as a soldier who knew each constellation as a guidepost, a friend, a witness. They had accompanied him on countless night marches, watched over him from the cradle, and now they hovered like sentinels in the black sky, silent, constant, and indifferent. He wondered how many men had stared at these very stars before battle, their breath caught in their chests, their hands trembling on spear shafts, their hearts whispering farewell to the world. These stars had seen it all, and they would see it again tomorrow. The cold crept in steadily, crawling through his greaves and up his spine. But Leon did not move. He welcomed the chill, let it seep into his skin. Spartan boys were taught to live in discomfort, to sleep on thorny reeds, to endure the winter winds with bare shoulders. Discomfort was a teacher, one of many in the long education of a hardship. And tonight, the lesson was clarity, the kind of clarity that only came in the hours before faith. His thoughts drifted to the shield resting beside him. It was circular, weighty, and etched with scars from years of service. It was more than wood and bronze. It was memory and promise. The shield had a voice, silent but profound, and it spoke of his father, who once wielded it. The old man had carried this very piece into battle during the war with Argos. Leon had watched, as a boy, when the shield was returned to their home, bloodied and cracked, carried not by his father, but by another. He had not cried then, nor screamed. His mother did not weep either. She placed her hands on the broken rim and whispered only, "He stood?" That was all. He stood, a phrase that Spartans lived and died by. Now it was Leon's turn to stand. He ran his fingers over the markings on the shield's inner ring, the faint grooves where fingers had gripped in desperation or determination. These were the echoes of those who had held the line, who had not broken rank when death pressed its weight against them. It was not glory that kept them firm, it was duty. A man did not fight for fame. A Spartan fought because to retreat was to betray. To drop your shield was to forsake your brothers, and tomorrow Leon would fight not to survive, but to fulfill a trust passed down through generations. He sat up slowly, the leather of his armor whispering against the ground. He could hear snoring from some of the younger men behind him, uneven, restless. He envied them a little. Youth allowed one to sleep before a battle. In his own younger days, sleep came easily the night before a skirmish. Now, with age and the full awareness of consequence, rest had become a stranger. His eyes drifted across the line of sleeping forms, bodies coiled in their cloaks, clutching their spears even in slumber. It struck him how mortal they all looked now, stripped of the bravado of daytime. Just men, sons, fathers, brothers, breathing quietly in the shadow of their final dawn. He stood and walked softly between them, careful not to stir the earth too loudly beneath his sandals. Each step brought him deeper into memory, further from the edges of fear. He recalled the agoge, the brutal, relentless training that had shaped him, the years of cold meals and colder stares from elders, the fights that left bruises and broken fingers, the days he bled to prove he belonged. He remembered the first time he killed, not on a battlefield, but during a final trial against another boy who wanted to be chosen. The memory was sharp, still bright, despite the years. He had not felt pride then, only necessity. That was how one became a Spartan, not by victory, but by acceptance of what must be done. He reached the edge of the encampment and stared into the pass. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow strip between mountain and sea. The wind carried with it the scent of salt water and sulfur, of damp earth and distant fire. The Persians were out there, perhaps only a mile or two now. Their campfires glowed faintly on the horizon, a flickering orange belt against the dark. He imagined them, tens of thousands of men murmuring in foreign tongues, armored in gold and iron with towering cavalry and archers by the thousands, a tidal wave of power. And yet, in this narrow strip of land, they would be met not by an army, but by a wall of souls who had already accepted death. He knew his name would not be remembered by many. History favored kings and commanders. Leonidas would be etched to the stone of time. But Leon, this simple son of a stonemason, he would vanish into the dust, carried away by the wind like countless others. And he was at peace with that, because the moment his spear met its mark, the moment his shield locked against his brother's, he would become more than a name. He would become a moment, a heartbeat in the great rhythm of resistance. That was enough. A soft voice rose behind him. Damon, one of the younger warriors, had awakened and stood silently beside him. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Leon shook his head, then offered a small smile. "Sleep is for those who don't know what's coming." Damon laughed quietly, a nervous, thin sound. "Do you think we'll win?" "No," Leon said, gently but firmly, "but we'll hold, and that is what matters." The younger man nodded, accepting the truth without protest. That was the Spartan way, not to chase false hope, but to build an unbreakable calm in its place. Together they stood in silence, two shadows against the ancient stone, watching as the sky began its subtle transformation. The stars blinked a little fainter now, and the horizon bloomed with the faintest blue, like ink dropped in water. Dawn was coming, and with it, fate. Leon turned to Damon. "Go rest. You'll need your strength." The young man hesitated, then obeyed. Leon remained where he was, rooted like an old tree in sacred soil. He breathed deeply, letting the salt wind fill his lungs, letting the cold wrap around his arms. The quiet before the storm was almost beautiful, and within that quiet, Leon repeated a single word to himself over and over, like a prayer. "Stand, stand, stand." The faintest blush of dawn began to ripple across the eastern sky, a diluted smear of pale lavender and dull amber spilling over the mountain tops. It didn't arrive with fanfare or sudden brilliance. It crept slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise, reluctant to cast light on the blood soon to be spilled. Leon remained unmoved, his figure motionless against the growing glow, the wind tugging gently at the edge of his cloak like a child asking a silent question. The stars, once so sharp and bright, now receded behind a veil of soft morning haze. They had done their part. Now it was the sun's turn to bear witness. Around him, the camp began to stir. It wasn't the chaos of fear, nor the disarray of dread. It was quiet, composed, solemn. A few warriors shifted under their cloaks, a cough here, a grunt there. Men slowly returning to the waking world, knowing full well this could be the last sunrise they'd ever see. They did not cry. They did not whisper final pleas to the gods. They stood, stretched, adjusted armor, checked the points of their spears. Every movement was deliberate, every breath a quiet act of defiance. Leon turned from the pass and made his way through the camp. The other Spartans nodded at him as he passed. They did not smile, for there was nothing light-hearted to offer now, but their eyes held weight, recognition, camaraderie, and above all, acceptance. They were already dead, in one sense, and because of that, they were free. In the center of the encampment, Leon knelt before a small altar made of flat stones stacked with care. Upon it sat a simple offering, a strip of dried meat, an olive branch, and a shard of obsidian carved into the shape of a spearhead. It was a quiet gesture to Ares, god of war, and Apollo, the divine archer. There would be no elaborate sacrifices, no long rituals. The Spartans offered what they had, a piece of themselves, and that was enough. He whispered no words, only bowed his head and pressed his forehead gently to the stone. Then he rose, the ritual complete. As he walked back toward his shield and spear, he saw a group of men gathered around Leonidas. The king stood tall, broad-shouldered and serene, his presence like an unshakable mountain in the midst of a storm. There were no speeches, there were no commands shouted through the ranks. Leonidas looked each man in the eye, clasped shoulders, nodded once. This was their oath, not to him, but to each other. Leon remembered the first time he saw the king, not as a boy, but as a newly initiated warrior during a campaign near Tegea. Leonidas had stood before a wall of fire and calmly ordered the phalanx to advance. His voice had cut through the smoke like a blade, low and steady. "If you fear the flames, burn with purpose." That phrase had haunted Leon ever since. Burn with purpose. That was the core of every Spartan. Turn pain into principle, turn fear into force. Now, on the edge of destruction, those words echoed louder than ever. The younger soldiers were gathering near the edge of the cliff, where the pass narrowed to a corridor of stone. Leon joined them, falling into line beside Damon and two others, Pyrrhos and Thales. None of them spoke. Their bond no longer required language. Each of them bore the marks of brutal training, scars both visible and hidden. Pyrrhos had a broken nose that never quite healed right. Thales had lost 3 fingers in a training duel. Damon, though the youngest, had eyes that had already seen enough suffering to understand what was coming. And Leon, he carried within him the weight of all the warriors who had come before and would never return. As they stood together, waiting for the call to move, Leon allowed his mind to drift, not into fantasy, but into memory. He thought of the Eurotas River, cold and shimmering, where as a child he had learned to swim in spring floods. He thought of his mother's face, stern but proud, as she handed him his first cloak at age 7. He remembered his father's funeral pyre, the way the flames curled around the shield laid atop it. He remembered the nights in the Agoge when hunger clawed at his belly like a wild beast, and the elders told him, "Hunger is the beginning of strength." And then there was her, Myrene. He saw her face clearly now, though the years had tried to dull her features, her hair dark as night, her eyes sharp as obsidian. She had not cried when he left for this campaign. She had simply looked at him and said, "Come back with your shield or on it." That phrase, said in 1,000 Spartan homes, carried no malice, only love expressed through the language of iron. She would not wait for him. If he fell, she would not wear mourning. She would teach their son what it meant to stand. That, too, was Spartan. The sun now breached the horizon fully, spilling golden light across the pass like a herald's trumpet. Shadows fled from the cliffs, revealing every crack in the stone, every scar in the landscape. The time had come. Leon gripped his shield and lifted it with ease. His fingers fit into the grooves perfectly, as if they had always belonged there. The spear in his other hand felt warm with anticipation. These were not tools, they were extensions of himself, shaped by years of repetition and readiness. The call came not as a shout, but as a simple wave from Leonidas. The Spartans began to move in silence like a river of iron flowing toward the mouth of history. Their sandals kicked up dust in rhythmic patterns. The clink of armor was a solemn melody. Leon kept his eyes forward, each step bringing him closer to the place where his name would dissolve into the stones. They reached the narrowest part of the pass. It was barely wide enough for 3 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The cliffs loomed high on either side, like ancient jaws waiting to snap shut. This was where they would hold. This was where the Persians would bleed. Leon took his position, Damon to his left, Pyrrhus to his right. Behind them, the next line of shields formed, then another, a phalanx layered like the scales of a serpent. They would move as one, strike as one, fall as one. There was still silence across the field. No drums yet, no horns. But Leon could feel them coming, a pressure in the air, a tremor in the earth. The Persians were near. He looked once more toward the horizon. There, in the shimmering distance, like a black tide rolling over the earth, the enemy emerged. Thousands, tens of thousands. Banners fluttered like wings of a great beast. Cavalry snorted and pawed the earth. Archers moved into formation. The entire sky seemed to darken, not from clouds, but from the sheer mass of bodies and breath. And yet, Leon felt no fear, only stillness. This was what he had been born into, not merely to die, but to define what death meant. He turned to Damon and whispered, "When they come, don't look at their numbers. Look at the space in front of you. That is all that matters." Damon nodded, and with that, the wind shifted. The Persian horn sounded, and the ground began to shake. The first wave came like a storm, but without rain, without thunder, without mercy. It came on horseback and foot, wrapped in scale armor that glinted beneath the morning sun like a field of broken glass. The sound of them, a living avalanche, drowned the whispering breeze and swallowed the silence whole. From where Leon stood, shield pressed to shield, spear at the ready, they seemed less like men and more like a single beast, many-limbed and eternal, descending from the distant lands of the east to devour the world. The Persians did not cry out for glory. They surged forward in organized ranks, as if confident that their sheer mass would erase whatever dared stand before them, and perhaps in any other place they might have been right. But here, in the narrow funnel of Thermopylae, their numbers meant little. They were too many to maneuver, too many to command with precision. The past betrayed them, turned their great multitude into a clogged river of flesh and steel. Leon's muscles were coiled. He felt the heat rise beneath his armor, though the morning was still cool. His hands gripped the spear in that familiar, unshakable rhythm taught by 1,000 drills. Elbow in, thrust straight, retrieve fast. No flourishes, no motion. The time for thinking had long passed. Now came the time of instincts honed to a razor's edge. The first Persians to reach them were light infantry, scouts with wicker shields and curved blades, fast, confident, and utterly doomed. They charged with wild cries, expecting perhaps to break the line with speed or surprise. But the Spartans did not flinch. They waited. Then the front line braced, knees bent, feet dug into dirt, arms tight behind bronze shields. Leon's spear struck the first man beneath the collarbone. He felt the tip catch bone, then slide past, tearing something soft and vital. He did not watch the man fall. He pulled back, turned slightly, and struck again. Another enemy dropped. This rhythm, thrust, retrieve, reset, was sacred. The men beside him moved as he did in perfect timing. It was not battle. It was music, played in blood. The Persians began to pile up against the shields. They fell onto each other, limbs tangled, screams rising like the hiss of a boiling cauldron. Still, the Spartans held. Spears snapped from use, and replacements were handed from behind. Shields grew slick with blood, but none gave way. The wall stood, unbroken, a monument of human resolve. Hours passed in this frenzy. Time lost all meaning. Leon no longer counted the fallen. His arms ached, but he ignored it. Pain was a drumbeat. Pain was proof that he still stood. Sweat poured from his brow, mixing with the grime of battle, dripping into his eyes. He blinked it away, saw another enemy rise before him, and drove his blade forward. Eventually, the Persians pulled back. It was not a retreat, not truly, more a hesitation, like a predator reevaluating its prey. Behind them, commanders barked orders in a tongue Leon did not understand. Banners waved, arrows were readied, the lull before the second storm. Leon stepped back from the front line to breathe. He felt the sting of a shallow cut across his bicep. Damon stood beside him, panting but unhurt. Pyros had a deep gash in his thigh, but still held his shield. Thales leaned on his spear, eyes narrowed, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Blood coated them all, but they stood, living monuments to what it meant to resist. Behind them, medics moved swiftly. They did not use words of comfort. They poured vinegar into wounds, slapped on bindings, passed water skins between bloodied fingers. Some of the younger hoplites vomited from the stench, but no one complained. This was sacred ground now, consecrated not by priests, but by sacrifice. Leon wiped his blade clean and looked to the sky. The sun was climbing now, higher and hotter. Its light caught the edges of his helmet, made him blink. But it also warmed his soul. He knew what the day would bring. He had no illusions of surviving this. But he had no desire to flee either. Every breath taken here was worth 1,000 beyond the walls of Sparta. As the next wave approached, he allowed his mind, just briefly, to return to home. He imagined his son standing in the training yard, stick in hand, mimicking the movements of his elders. He imagined Myrene watching from the doorway, her arms crossed, her gaze proud and stern. He hoped she would tell their son what his father did, not to glorify war, but to teach him what it meant to stand when others fell. The Persians came again, this time with archers and heavy infantry. The sky darkened as arrows flew. The Spartans raised their shields and let the storm fall. A few cries rang out, some men pierced, some blinded, but the line held. Then the archers stopped, and the footmen surged. This wave was slower, heavier. They wore plated armor and carried broad swords. They believed themselves superior to the Greeks in strength and discipline, but they had never fought Spartans. They had never felt the cold resolve of men who trained their entire lives for this one day. Leon met them head on. The clash was thunder. Swords scraped against bronze. Teeth shattered beneath hilts. Men screamed, not in fear, but in fury. Leon's shield absorbed a blow, and he twisted, drove his shoulder forward, knocking his opponent off balance. His spear followed, quick, ruthless. He did not check to see if the man lived. Another came, another fell. Blood turned the earth into sludge. The air stank of iron and sweat. Still they fought, still they stood. And eventually the second wave fell back too. Another pause, another breath. Leon bent, scooped water from a skin, and poured it over his head. The shock woke something deep in him, pushed back the exhaustion. He looked again at the king. Leonidas stood tall, eyes fixed on the horizon, his expression unchanged. The man was stone, flame, law made flesh. The Spartans reformed, adjusted ranks, reinforced the front. The third wave would come soon. Perhaps it would be the immortals, the elite of Xerxes' army, robed and masked, trained to kill from youth. Leon welcomed the thought. Let the best come. Let the chosen meet the doomed. Because here, death had already been accepted. There was no fear, only clarity. And in that clarity, Leon found something close to peace. The lull between battles wasn't quiet. It was a smothered roar beneath the surface. Leon could feel it in his bones, in the tremble of the earth, in the whispered murmurs of breathless warriors wiping blood from their brows. The Persians were regrouping again, and this time it would not be another test. It would be a reckoning. The immortals were coming. He knew the stories. Every Spartan had heard them. An elite corps of 10,000 warriors called immortals, not because they were divine, but because their ranks never appeared to diminish. One fell, and another immediately took his place. It created the illusion that they could not die, that their strength was eternal. Illusion or not, it was about to collide with something far more enduring, the will of men who had already accepted death. Leon leaned his back against the rock wall for a brief moment of reprieve. His legs trembled, not from fear, but from endless exertion. Each muscle in his body throbbed, torn between fatigue and duty. Across the narrow pass, other Spartans did the same. No one spoke. Words had no place here anymore. They communicated through glances, nods, small gestures. Trust did not require conversation. He stared down at his hands. The calluses had long since torn open. His palms were cracked, raw, caked in blood, some his, most not. And yet he gripped the spear like it was part of his body. It felt heavier now, more like a burden than a weapon. But burdens like fear had no power over Spartans. A horn echoed through the pass, a deep, resonant blast. The sound curled around the rocks like smoke, seeping into every crevice, every ear. It was not a Spartan signal. It came from the enemy. The immortals had been unleashed. Leon pushed off the wall and returned to the line. Shields were raised, helmets adjusted, breaths drawn in deep, then held like oaths. There was no cheering, no rallying cry, only readiness. The Persians appeared in the distance, disciplined, composed, their dark robes billowing behind them like shadows given form. They moved as a single body, silent and deliberate, their spears gleaming beneath the midday sun. The very sight of them would have unnerved lesser men, but the Spartans welcomed them. It was a strange thing, Leon thought, how death could be so beautiful when faced without fear. The two forces collided with less fury than before, but with far greater precision. The immortals didn't rush. They advanced in waves, probing the Spartan line, searching for weakness. Leon's spear danced with theirs, a deadly ballet of inches and instincts. Every move had consequence. A mistimed thrust could mean death. A hesitation could shatter the shield wall. Leon fought like a man possessed, not with rage, but with focus. He moved mechanically, each action honed by endless training. Step, thrust, shield up, step, thrust, twist, withdraw. His world narrowed to the small space before him, the enemy's chest, their eyes, the glint of steel rising and falling, the pass, the sky, even the cries around him blurred into nothing. The immortals adapted quickly. They tried to hook shields, to stab beneath them, to pull Spartans off balance. But the formation held. Even when a Spartan was wounded or killed, the gap was filled before the enemy could exploit it. It was not just discipline, it was identity. Every Spartan was a thread in a greater tapestry, and that tapestry did not tear. Leon took a blade across his side, shallow but hot. Pain flared. He didn't wince. He stepped into it, drove his spear into the attacker's throat and kicked the corpse aside. Blood soaked through his tunic. He ignored it. Pain was temporary. Purpose was not. And still they came. The immortals, one after another. 10 fell, then 20, then 50. Leon began to wonder, how many could they truly have? How many men did Xerxes bring to this narrow grave? He looked once toward King Leonidas. The king stood in the thick of it, shield up, spear flashing like lightning. The immortals had targeted him repeatedly, but they had failed each time. The king was unshakable, a mountain in the storm. His presence alone was a battle cry louder than any horn. Hours passed. The sun began to tilt westward. Shadows stretched long across the pass. The dead lay in heaps, Persian and Greek alike. The ground was slick, uneven, filled with the moans of the dying and the silence of the dead. Crows circled overhead, their black wings whispering omens that no one cared to interpret. Leon's spear finally broke. The shaft splintered against a bronze helm, and he let it go without pause. He drew his Xyphos, the short sword every Spartan carried for when the line closed. It was not meant for elegant duels. It was a weapon of brutal necessity. He used it well. He ducked beneath a Persian slash, drove the blade into the man's gut, twisted, and stepped aside. Another came, another fell. The world around him had become surreal, bathed in red and noise, where time expanded and collapsed at will. A moment could last forever. An hour could pass unnoticed. Eventually, the immortals too began to falter. It was not because they were weak. It was because they were human. They bled, they tired, and they had never faced resistance like this. Not in all their conquests, not in all their disciplined training. Leon felt it, a shift. The enemy pulled back, leaving their dead behind like shed skin. The pass fell quiet again, except for the rasp of breathing and the low groans of the wounded. The Spartans did not cheer. There was no victory to be claimed, only survival. He looked around. The ground was littered with corpses. The stench was unbearable. Blood ran like streams through the cracks in the rock. Flies buzzed in frenzied clouds. And yet, amidst it all, the line still stood. Damon was gone. Leon hadn't seen him fall. Thales was slumped against the wall, one arm hanging limp, the other still gripping his sword. Pyrrhus was down on one knee, wrapping a strip of cloth around his calf, his expression blank. Leon's heart ached, but not with sorrow, with pride. These were the men who stood against an empire. These were the few who had defied fate itself. He sat briefly, letting his body sink into the moment. He did not sleep. Sleep was for the dead. But he closed his eyes and listened to the breath of his comrades, to the rustle of banners, to the wind whispering through the stones. He thought of his son again. He hoped the boy would live long enough to know what happened here, not through song or tale, but through bloodlines and memory. He hoped Sparta would not forget, that the stand here would echo through generations. Night would fall soon, and with it, the next wave. Leon rose, sword in hand, eyes steady. The darkness would come, but so would they. And until the last breath left his body, he would not step back. Twilight fell with a hush. The sky turned from blistering gold to a bruised purple, the sun bleeding out behind the mountains. As shadows poured over Thermopylae like watered-down stone, the battlefield became a tomb of silence. Not even the crows dared break it now. They watched from afar, circling like patient priests over a funeral that had not yet concluded. Leon stood on trembling legs, half supported by a shield. His body, though trained to endure beyond the limits of most men, was no longer a stranger to the creeping weight of exhaustion. Yet even as his muscles stiffened and bruises darkened across his skin, there was no room in his mind for surrender. This was the moment all his years of training had carved into his destiny. He was not merely resisting death, he was defining it. The Spartans had used the lull after the immortals' retreat to tend wounds, reinforce their line, and retrieve weapons from the dead. Spears were snapped from fallen Persians, swords scavenged, shields repurposed. Death had become their supplier. It was no longer about maintaining glory. It was about maintaining resistance. As dusk bled deeper, Leon turned his gaze toward the distant sea. The waves lapped softly against the rocks, an indifferent rhythm compared to the chaos on land. Somewhere out there, ships still moved under Xerxes' command, while others had shattered against the fury of Poseidon's storms days earlier. But none of that mattered now. The war was here, in this sliver of stone and sweat, between men who had already accepted their fate and those who still believed they could escape it. Leonidas walked the line now, as he had every night since the battle began. The king did not speak with a grandeur or fanfare. He simply met the eyes of each man, a silent communion of steel and resolve. When he paused before Leon, there was a flicker of emotion, pride maybe, or sorrow, too heavy to voice. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Their bond was forged in fire and fortified in blood. Leon's mind began to wander, not from distraction, but from a strange serenity that had settled into his bones. The fatigue, once pressing, became background noise. He thought of his mother, long buried beneath the olive trees near Sparta. He could still hear her voice on the morning he left for his agolge, stern and soft at once. Strength isn't in the fist, my son. It's in the silence that comes after the blow. He had never forgotten that. The night crept in slowly, wrapping itself around the pass like a cloak. Torches were lit, though their flames were kept low. The Spartans did not need light to feel what was coming. The Persians were not finished. No, this was only a pause, one final breath before the next collapse of thunder. From the cliffs above, faint noises echoed. Movement, metal, shadows where none should be. Leon's eyes narrowed. He wasn't the only one who had heard it. Pyrrhus was already staring up, his brows knit in concern. "They've found the goat path," Pyrrhus whispered. Leon nodded grimly. That had always been the risk. The narrow trail through the mountains, winding around the pass, had been guarded by Phocians, local allies tasked with defending the rear. But Leon knew, even as he hoped, that their will might not match a Persian bribe or a Persian blade. Sooner or later, the enemy would come from behind. The knowledge didn't spark panic. It birthed clarity. Every Spartan understood that they were not here to survive. They were here to delay, to embody defiance, to etch their sacrifice into the bones of history so deeply that even gods would weep to erase it. Leon pulled his battered cloak tighter and glanced at the horizon. Stars began to bloom, indifferent sentinels of a world too large to notice the struggles of men. He wondered if his ancestors watched from beyond, if the shades of warriors past stood shoulder to shoulder with them now. He whispered an old Spartan prayer, barely audible, Come back with your shield or on it." And he smiled. He had no intention of returning. The night wore on. Some men slept, heads bowed in exhaustion, still gripping weapons as though afraid Hades might pry them loose in their sleep. Others kept watch, eyes flickering toward the mountain trail. Every creak in the dark, every footfall of a fox or falling stone sent hearts into battle-ready rhythm. Then, not long before dawn, came the horn, low, mournful, distant. It did not belong to Sparta. Leon's head snapped up. He met Thales' gaze across the line. No words, just the same realization written in both their eyes. They were coming, from both sides. Within moments, the pass erupted into chaos again, not the kind sparked by fear, but by resolve. Shields raised, ranks formed, orders barked low and fast. Every man took his place as if summoned by fate itself. The Persians approached from the front again, this time led by a renewed force. But the sound of movement behind confirmed the truth. They had been outflanked. The Phocians had failed. The rear was compromised. Leon knew the strategy had to shift. The Thespians, brave allies from Boeotia, stood beside them now, unpaid, uncoerced, volunteering to die in place of retreat. Leon turned to them with gratitude and sorrow. Men like these reminded him that courage was not born of bloodlines alone. Leonidas issued the final commands. Most of the Greek allies would be ordered to retreat, to carry the warning back to the cities beyond. But the Spartans would stay. The Thespians, too. Those who remained understood that the sun rising this day would never set for them again. Leon took his place in the new formation. He could feel the dawn stirring behind the cliffs, its first rays inching like fire over the stones. A new day, but not for them. This would be the final stand. He gripped his gyphos and looked once more at his brothers. Not one wavered. Not one looked away. They were about to be surrounded, crushed by the weight of an empire, and not one of them cared. The air was thick now, the smell of earth and blood mingling in the breeze. Dawn had broken, but it brought no hope, only the harsh, unforgiving light that illuminated the inevitable. The sounds of the Persians' march were deafening, a chorus of metal and boots crushing the earth beneath them, their numbers endless, like the tide rising to swallow all that stood in its path. Yet, to Leon and his warriors, the sound was merely a reminder of what they had come to do, what they had always known they would do. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked together in a wall of iron and determination. Their spears, bloodied and worn from the battles of the previous days, were held with the same discipline they had been taught since childhood. The Spartans' formation was perfect, unwavering, despite the shadows closing in from both sides. Leon's heart beat steady, not from fear, but from the sharp, unyielding knowledge that this was their destiny. This was the price they had agreed to pay. Leonidas stood at the head of the line, his form tall and resolute. His eyes, once fierce with the fire of leadership, now carried the weight of what was to come. His body bore the marks of battle, cuts, bruises, and fatigue, but his spirit, his will, was unbroken. With every passing moment, he drew strength from the men around him, his brothers in arms who had followed him, not out of duty alone, but because they believed, as he did, that this stand was worth more than survival. It was a stand for honor, for freedom, and for a future they would never live to see. In the silence before the storm, Leon's mind drifted once more, but not to the battlefield or the impending onslaught. Instead, he thought of the past, the echo of his childhood lessons, his trials as a boy, the harsh demands of the agage. He remembered his father, Leonidas's voice low and steady, teaching him that strength came not from the muscles, but from the heart that knew when to fight, when to stand, and when to die. That strength was a burden, a path that only those with true resolve could walk. And now, in the face of this endless tide, Leon knew that the time had come to walk that path. The Persian forces loomed closer. From the front, their banners, bright, regal, and full of numbers beyond imagination, fluttered in the breeze. Behind them, the echoes of the reinforcements were unmistakable. The second wave had arrived. Leon's gaze swept across the ranks. His men, battle-worn but resolute, the Thespians beside them, the last of the Greek allies standing firm. There was no retreat, no turning back. There was only the relentless march forward, the shield held high, the spear thrust toward the enemy. The first wave of Persians hit like a crashing wave against their line, the force pushing the Spartans back by inches, but never breaking them. Each Spartan a stone pillar in the face of an ocean. The sound of clashing metal, the grunts of warriors locked in the savage embrace of combat, filled the air. Leon could hear his own breath, sharp and quick, like a drumbeat in his chest. His shield rose and fell with practiced ease, parrying, blocking, thrusting. Each movement was deliberate, a dance of death he had been trained for since birth. There was no room for hesitation, no place for doubt. They were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for a cause far greater than that. As the Persians pressed, the Spartan ranks began to tighten. They fought with the ferocity of men who had accepted their fate, who understood that in this moment there was nothing left but to protect each other, to die together. Leon's mind, though still sharp, felt the weight of his body, the ache of exhaustion that gnawed at his every muscle. But the pain didn't matter. The battle had transcended the physical. This was about the spirit of Sparta, of warriors who fought not for themselves, but for the future they would never see. And that spirit, Leon knew, could never be crushed. The second wave crashed against them, fiercer than the first. But the Spartans held, line after line, shield after shield, moving as one unbroken unit. Their spears struck with precision, their swords cleaved through the air with deadly grace. Leon's arms were heavy with the weight of his shield, but he never lowered it. The men beside him, his brothers, his comrades, moved with the same unwavering determination. No Persian could break them. They were an unstoppable force, as if the gods themselves had imbued them with divine purpose. Then, from the corner of his eye, Leon saw it. The goat path, the trail they had feared, was now swarming with enemy soldiers. The Phocians, the last line of defense, had fallen. The Persians were coming from behind. The circle was tightening. The last shred of hope, the last hope for survival, was gone. Leon's heart did not falter. He turned to his men, his voice steady, even though his body screamed in pain. "We hold," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything they stood for. "We hold till the end." The men around him nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They were not afraid. They were warriors. They were Spartans. The sun was higher now, but the shadows grew longer. As the battle raged on, it became clear the Spartans could not hold forever. Their numbers were too few, their strength too worn. But they would not die in vain. They would not fall quietly. The last breath of their resistance would be a roar, a final defiance against the crushing tide of the Persian Empire. Leon stood, unyielding, until the very last. The Persian forces closed in from every side, their swords raised, their war cries filling the air like the call of the storm. But Leon did not flinch. He stood firm, shield raised, spear in hand, facing the enemy with the same defiant gaze he had held his entire life. And then, with a final surge, the Spartans met their fate. There was no moment of peace, no quiet resignation. There was only the clash of steel, the cry of men fighting until their bodies could no longer bear the weight. Leon fought until the end, his movements as fierce as the first moment of battle. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he held his ground. As the battle finally reached its tragic conclusion, as the last Spartan fell, the battlefield became still once more. The once proud pass of Thermopylae lay littered with the bodies of the fallen, but amidst the carnage, the legacy of their sacrifice remained. The Persians had won the day, but they had not broken the spirit of the warriors who had stood against them. The name of Sparta would live on in every whispered prayer, every tale told by the fireside, and every heart that beat with the courage to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. The gods might have turned their gaze away, but the souls of the Spartans remained, immortalized in the blood-soaked earth where they had made their final stand.